So these three comedians walk into a bar. The bartender looks at him and he says, "Hey, you guys got any airbrush jokes?" The first one says, "I'm kind of thin on them right now." The second one says, "Hey, don't put me under that kind of pressure, man." The third one says, "Yeah, I do, but I'm still practicing them." I still ain't got no airbrush jokes. Hey, I'm John. I guess there aren't any really good airbrush jokes. Oh well. Today, in this third episode of getting started in airbrushing, I'm going to be looking at some practical demonstration. I'm going to be showing you how to use the airbrush. The first video covered picking your airbrush. The second video covered picking your air source. So this one's going to be looking at the meat and potatoes, how to put it all together. Throughout this video, the airbrush I'm going to be using is Badger's Patriot 105 airbrush. It's a very good dual action gravity fed airbrush that I highly recommend for anyone. It's what I use most of the time. But you don't have to use this one, of course. What I'm going to show you is going to be fairly generic in terms of airbrush brand and type. So even if what you have is different, keep watching. I think it'll be helpful to look at the basic principles and the basic techniques that I'm going to be demonstrating in this video. Okay, to talk just a little bit about the materials that I'm going to be using so you'll know exactly where I'm starting from. I've got, of course, my airbrush. I've got it hooked up to the compressor with an air line. I have my air pressure gauge in place. I have my moisture trap in place. I've got the air pressure set to about 18 psi. If you're just starting out, I mean, if you've never done it before, that's a good starting point. You'll figure out over time what your preferred air pressure is, but that's one I recommend to start at. I've got some paints ready to go. I'm going to be using Tamiya paints this morning. I just like the way they airbrush. One other note before I get started. You can practice on milk jugs and cardboard and plastic spoons. All of those things are great ways to just get started blowing paint through the airbrush and seeing what works and what doesn't. But as I pointed out in the first video in this series, ultimately you have to paint models. You have to airbrush models to get better at airbrushing. There's no two ways about it. You can experiment, you can test, you can do all of those things for hours and hours and hours. But until you're actually airbrushing a model and getting experience doing there where it counts, you're not going to make a lot of progress. So don't be afraid to get your airbrush, load the paint in, start painting your model, and if you make some mistakes, figure out how to recover from them, because I think that's one of the greatest skills that the experienced modeler has, is not so much application of technique, application of product, but being able to recover from problems. So don't be afraid to go ahead, blow some paint on your model, make some mistakes, figure out how to fix them. In the end, you'll be better off. Okay, I want to take just a minute to look a little bit at the airbrush that I'll be using this morning, Badger's 105 Patriot. It's a dual action gravity fed airbrush. Paint goes in here at the top, it flows through the body, the air will pull it out the front. The way the trigger works is if you push down, you get air. When you pull back, you get paint. So it's a fairly simple operation. I've read online, some people talk about that you need to start with a single action so you get used to that before you go to a dual action. I started with a single action. I bought that advice. When I got to a double action airbrush, I found out I really didn't need that single action airbrush to start with. It's not real hard to get the concept of push down, pull back. You'll figure out within the first half hour of your airbrushing journey how all that works. So don't get hung up on you've got to start on a single action airbrush. But this is a very common, very simple design. I also want to take a brief moment just to look at some paints and some thinners and say a word about those. Today I'm going to be using Tamiya's X20A thinner and various colors of their acrylic range. These are very good paints. I use them on just about every model and I really like them. They airbrush very nicely. Not always so great for brush painting, but airbrushing they're very good. You may have other paints such as Vallejo. There's different lines of Vallejo paint. This is one of the Vallejo Mecha Color paints. They have their own airbrush thinner. You'll read a lot about thinners online. You'll hear a lot of opinions. You'll hear people say that Vallejo airbrush thinner is nothing more than Windex and water, which is not true. You'll hear that Tamiya's X20A thinner is nothing more than isopropyl alcohol, which is not true. I've seen the material safety data sheets. They're different than what is often said. You can use some thinners with paints from another brand. As you become experienced, you'll get to know what works with what. However, getting started, I would recommend that you settle on a brand of paint that you'd like to use and get that paint manufacturer's thinner so that it eliminates the variables that may be involved in trying to figure out what's compatible. Go ahead, get the same brand, and then later on figure out what works and what doesn't with that brand. Ignore what the guy at the IPMS National says, you know, when you're standing in line at the nachos stand and he says, you know, oh, you can just use whatever for anything. If you're getting started, make sure you're getting the same brands of paint and thinner just to make your life a little easier. Like I said earlier, I'll be using Tamiya paints, Tamiya thinner for this. Now, there are several ways to get your paint and your thinner into your color cup. I use a method that sometimes I read that people say, oh, you should never do it this way, but I do it because it works. I add the thinner into my color cup, and then after thoroughly mixing my paint, I take a brush and I dip it in my paint and I swirl it around in the color cup and I mix it right in the color cup. For smaller quantities of paint, that works fine. You can also get small measuring cups and put the thinner in and your paint in and mix them ahead of time and pour them in here. That works also. I don't do it simply because it takes a little more time, and with the publication schedule that I work under, I try to get things done quickly. So don't get too hung up about mixing your paints and where you mix it and how you mix it. The main thing is you want to mix thinner with paint and get it into the color cup. All right, with all of that behind us, I'm going to go ahead and start showing you how to actually thin your paints and talk about the ratios that I work with and that you'll find helpful, I think, as a starting point. All right, the first thing I want to demonstrate is how to know when your paint is properly thinned. People will say it's a 50-50 ratio. Manufacturers will say 70-30, 80-20, 60-40, who knows what ratios you'll hear. The best way to gauge if your paint is thinned enough for airbrushing is visually, not through any particular ratio. And the best way to know what it should look like is to get some 2% milk. And that's what I have in this little syringe. And I'm going to put some milk in my airbrush. There. Don't worry, no cows were harmed in the making of this. Now, when you get that milk in the airbrush, take a minute to move it around like that to see how it looks, to see how it clings to the side of the color cup and doesn't cling to the side of the color cup. Look at the opacity near the edges. How much of the color cup can you see through that? Think of it as white paint. Another thing you'll want to do is get a brush, any reasonable size brush, it doesn't matter which kind. Stick it in there and drop some paint up on the edge of the color cup and watch how it behaves. Look at the opacity. Look at when it flows back in, look at the marks that it leaves on the color cup. Getting a good familiarization with this process is going to be the best thing I think you can do to understanding how thin your paint needs to be. This is how thin it needs to be, right here. As you get experienced, you'll find times that you may want it a little thinner or maybe a little thicker. But starting off, this is the point that you're looking for when it comes to thinness with regards to your paint. Another thing I want to note, and this is just briefly because this could be a subject of its own video. For the demonstration, I'm going to be using this Hobby Boss quick build kit of F6, F5 Hellcat. The subject doesn't really matter, I just needed plastic to paint on. Now, I've primed this with Badger's Stynylrez primer. My advice with regards to priming is always prime your model, unless you know why you don't need to prime your model. And I don't mean that to sound elitist, but if you're not sure which cases would warrant not priming, and there can be many, then it's best to just go ahead and prime. It won't hurt to prime a model, even if it's not needed. So after you've been working with your airbrush for a while and with paints for a while, you'll get a better understanding of what works and what doesn't with regards to priming. But to start with, I recommend priming everything. It just gives you a good basis for your paint to grip onto, a nice smooth surface, and a solid tone that underlies the paint for the whole model. All right, it's time to put some paint in our color cup. So I'm going to be starting with, to me, is XF70 Dark Green 2. I picked this simply because it's a high contrast color with the primer coat. Now, a lot of folks I know like to fill the color cup up with paint, and you do what you want. I like to use the least amount of paint necessary for what I'm doing. I would rather have to fill up the paint color cup an extra time rather than having a whole lot sloshing around. So that's just kind of a philosophy thing. You do what you want. Now, I'll be using X20A thinner, which is the Tamiya proprietary thinner for this paint. I've put some in a bottle because it makes it real handy to put some in to my color cup. And all I'm going to do for this demonstration is I'm going to put in enough so that I see it moving up the neck of the color cup, and then I'm going to stop. So I've just got about that much in there. Not much at all. Now I'm simply going to take my paint, I'm going to dip the brush in the paint, and I'm going to get a good good blob of it there. I'll let that drop off. And then I'm just going to stir it in. And what I do is I dab the brush against the side of the color cup and I watch the paint flow down. That's where I can tell whether I've got it thin enough. I may need to add a few more drops of thinner. I may need to add a little bit more paint. But this is why it's so important to see how that milk looks, because this is going to need to be the same consistency. I like how that looks, so I'm going to go with it. All right, the first thing I do before I start airbrushing any model is I get a piece of paper towel or scrap plastic or something that I can shoot some paint against, and I go ahead and spray some on. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be pushing down the trigger first and getting full flow of air, and then I'm going to gradually pull the trigger back and see how the flow looks. And you see the green is coming through nicely. Now, don't be deceived if you're doing this against a paper towel. Because it absorbs the liquid very quickly, you can impress yourself with nice fine lines that may look really good on this paper towel. But if you try the same thing on the model, it may or may not work. But this lets you just see how the paint is flowing if you're ready to start airbrushing. And for this, we are. I've already had one take, as you can see, by the paint that's there on the model. So this is take two, more from a problem with my words than with the paint. So anyway, I like to start off getting the flow established off the model and then just bring it right onto the model. And I'm laying down a fairly thick coat here, but because this Tamiya paint is very thin, I can build it up. Now, the first time you do it, you shouldn't get full coverage immediately. You want to let it go on there a little thin and still have some translucency to it, so you can see a little bit of the primer through that. But you can see that started building up the color fairly nicely. I didn't hold the airbrush way out here. I didn't hold it very close like that. I simply got up, I'm probably about 1.5 inches, 2 inches away, and I just began spraying. Now once you start getting the color like you want it, you can go back over the area. This Tamiya paint flash dries very quickly. So I can go back and begin applying essentially a second coat fairly quickly after the first one. Now notice I'm working in sections. I'm not at this point haphazardly doing it. You can do that. That's a technique to make your paint look as if it's a little bit distressed. If you start adding in, if you've ever heard me or read about me using the term scribbling, this is what I'm talking about. You can do that as an effect on top of other paint, but to get your base coat down, I recommend just going back and forth, working in sections, just like that. Never letting the brush stay in one area for too long. And I'm going a little bit off of the model each time I make a pass, but not too far. Now, one thing to note on aircraft, well, any model that has recessed detail, you may have to turn it at a slightly different angle to get some of that detail painted in. Like the edge of that aileron there. And keep that in mind if you're painting, say, the top of the fuselage here, you may get some overspray on the wing. So if you don't want that, keep that in mind, because you will have times that you may get overspray. I'm going to continue on this wing and get it colored in. And I know Hellcats aren't green, but to tell the truth, I didn't have any dark blue for it. So this became a green Hellcat. Now I will admit, I'm doing this a little slower than I normally do, simply for demonstration's sake. I want to be very clear about what I'm doing. Now at this point, I'm looking for specific places where the opacity is not fully there yet. So while I'm going back and forth, I may see an area that I want to fill in a little more. And there we have our green wing. Okay, once you've painted on one color, you may want to paint on a second color. I've got a little bit of paint left in my color cup, and there's a little bit up the sides. I deliberately left the cap off so that I could quickly make reference into the color cup. I normally would recommend that you have the color cup covered up with your cap. So I want to make a paint change here quickly, and there's a lot of ways to do this. I know somebody's going to tell me how this is wrong the way I do it because somebody else does it another way. Here's the way I suggest. You pick what works for you. I'm going to start off by putting in a little bit of my thinner, like that. And then I'm going to get my brush that I used to originally add the paint, and I'm just going to stir it around. Now that's going to be a little thinner, obviously, than I would want to use for painting, but this is switching colors. Then I get a jar. This may be a little out of focus because of its size, but this is just, I think it was spaghetti sauce. I keep loads of these jars around. And I'm just going to pour it out, like that. And then I'm going to do it again. Put in a little more thinner, stir it around, pour it out. All right, once I've poured out the excess, I'm going to give it a wipe down with this paper towel. Now, truth be told, I usually use my t-shirt for this. I wear old t-shirts when I airbrush so they don't get messed up. And a lot of times it's just easier to use a piece of soft t-shirt, but for this video I'm going to try and look a little more refined. So I'm going to use a piece of paper towel. And I'm not trying to get every bit of it out. I just wipe it down as far as I can. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do before a color change is I'm going to get my handy dandy spray jar. These are available at most hobby shops, craft stores, and online. It's just a jar with a place that you can stick the end of your airbrush in and a vent to let the air out, and there's a filter there. And I'm going to pour in some more of my thinner, and you can see there's still some color in there. But I'm just going to quickly shoot it through there. Work the trigger back and forth a little bit. Do it one more time. And this time I'm seeing clear in the cup. And I'm ready for another color. All right, for my second color, I'm going to be using Khaki XF49 from Tamiya. No, the two don't go together, but again, I chose this more for a little bit of contrast. As before, I'll simply put in some of the thinner in my airbrush. Get a brush full of paint. There's always that one drop that wants to come off before you do it. And I'll see how this looks. And again, that's what I want. Now, obviously, I've done this quite a few times over the years, so I know that this brush and that amount of thinner are going to deliver the right consistency of the paint. You may have to play with it a few times as you're starting in airbrushing. So don't think that there's a magic size of brush that does it. It's repetition, it's practice that has helped me figure out about how much I need to do. Okay, as before, I'm going to test the flow of my paint, make sure that it's coming through okay. I'll give it a little bigger blast, and that looks good to go. So I'm going to grab my model again, and starting on the paper towel, I'm going to simply begin painting this additional color. Now, you can freehand your camo, you can mask it off. The point here is not to demonstrate camouflage patterns, but rather it's to demonstrate paint color change. Because sometimes you may want to paint a completely different part of the model. So the point here is not the camo. The point here is the color change. Although I can make a note about this. You notice that it's really easy to do the freehand camo with your paints thin like this. You build up the color, and you can get a pretty good demarcation going there. Now, if I was using this is a 0.5 needle airbrush. If I was using a 0.3, I would get in even closer and dial my air pressure down and get a much finer edge there. But you'll notice again, I'm building it up until that green color is covered up. And there it is. You know, now that I look at it, I actually like those colors together. But as I was mentioning earlier, if you were painting a completely different part of the model, a color switch could be for that reason also. I can start right in on this other wing with this color if I want. All right, I want to look at a couple of scenarios of knowing when airbrushing is going wrong. If you shoot from too far away, the paint can dry in the air. And while you may you'll see the paint going on the model, depending on the paint manufacturer, how it's thinned and everything like that, you could get a bit of a rough texture the further away you shoot, because the paint's actually drying in the air before it gets to the model. So if you start seeing some rough texture as you're painting, but the primer coat is actually smooth, you may be shooting from too far away. Another thing to avoid is getting too close in and letting the paint build up too quickly. Now I'm going to exaggerate this so you'll see, but here you can see I've established a good flow of paint right there. And I'm painting it on and it's working just fine, but if I start getting in real close, the closer I get in, the more that paint wants to run. And if I really start increasing, you see what it's doing there? Now that was a little exaggerated for the sake of the video, but if you start seeing those little lines going out, it's called spidering. That's what I call it. Some people call it a Kaiser blade. I call it a sling blade. Or is it the other way around? Anyway, sorry. If you start seeing that happening, it can mean you're shooting in too close, which is what I was doing there. Your paint is too thin. If you're shooting out here and it's doing that, your paint is way too thin. If it's doing that and you're in close, you're either shooting too much paint or you're too close. If I back off, the paint flow suddenly becomes pretty good. If I decrease the paint flow and move in, I can start getting very fine results. But if you start seeing that spidering like that, then it can be a combination of the thinness of the paint and the distance from which you're shooting. So keep that in mind. Another issue that people often run into, especially when they're starting to airbrush, is not thinning their paints enough. And if that happens, you can start getting splattering of the paint. Now my paint here is fairly thin, so I can't demonstrate it. But if you're seeing the paint come out in little blobs, it's splattering onto the surface, then more than likely you've got your paint too thick. Thin it down a little bit at a time. Use it as a learning experience to see at what point it's going to start shooting correctly. Now, if you do get mistakes like this on your paint, as long as they're smooth mistakes, in other words, they don't introduce a texture to the model, you can actually airbrush over it and cover it up. You may have to give it a few passes to build up the opacity, but you can very easily cover up mistakes with your airbrush. Now, because I deliberately made this paint very thin for demonstration purposes, it'll take me a little while to build this up, but trust me, you can cover that up, because since it did not leave a texture, it's smooth enough underneath. One thing to note though, you notice as you're covering it up, it actually leaves a cool effect. That shows that sometimes if you use one color, and this is just, I'm going to move this aside. If you shoot one color in a pattern like this, it's kind of distressed, and then go over with a slightly lighter color, it can give you great tonal variation on the surface of the model. So it's just kind of a bonus tip that you may find useful as you're airbrushing. All right, the final step I want to go over, now that we've got the model painted like we want, is cleaning out the airbrush at the end of a session. It's a little different than cleaning it between color changes, and I'm going to show you some additional steps. Now, as with a color change, there are a lot of different methods to do this, to clean your airbrush out. I'm going to tell you simply that this is the one I use. I've done it hundreds of times. I like it. There may be better methods, there may be worse methods. This is what I use, and it's what I like. Again, I start with some thinner, and I put in the color cup, and I get my brush, and I just stir it around a bit. I'm trying to get any paint that's dried along the sides of the color cup, I'm trying to break that up, and I'm trying to get it out of the recesses at the bottom of the color cup so that I can pour it out. Off camera, I'm just wiping the brush down. Now I get my waste jar and I pour that in. I'm going to grab a piece of paper towel and wipe it off the edge, and I'm just going to give it a quick rub down on the inside. Pardon if this is off camera or out of focus. Once again, put in some thinner. But this time I'm going to take a step to get more paint out of the color cup. There's a little nozzle down here, and paint will build up in there. It will stay in there. So one way to flush it out is to get something to cover up the end of the airbrush. Now you have to be real careful not to bend that needle. What I'm going to do is I'm not actually putting hardly any pressure against that needle, and I'm going to hold it there, and as I pull the trigger back, I'm going to go ahead and continue to add pressure so that I don't bend my needle. I'll go for the air, And then I begin pulling back, and basically I make bubbles. That gets more of the paint out of the color cup. And again, I offloaded it into my jar. It's a little off camera. I moved it out of camera range. Now, when you're doing this, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a few spots of paint that bubbled out. So whenever you do this step, make sure that your model and anything else you don't want paint getting bubbled on is out of the way. Now, there's still a little paint there in the bottom, so I'm going to put in a little more thinner. I'm going to break it up a bit. And I'm going to repeat this process. You can use a piece of t-shirt, anything that'll just block up the end of it works. I've even seen some people use, they'll pinch it with their fingers, and that does work. The reason I don't do that, and I don't know if this is true, if the guy was just making it up, but one guy told me about, he would pinch it like that and use it to backflush the airbrush. One time he poked himself a little, the needle actually poked him under the skin a little bit, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal. So when he pushed for the air, he said his finger inflated, like the end of his finger just like blew up with air. Maybe he was making it up, maybe not. It freaked me out enough that I decided, you know what, I'm going to use the paper towel. So you do what you want. Now, once you've backflushed it a couple of times, and you can start seeing the thinner looking generally clear. I don't go for it to be completely clear, but generally clear. That's when I go in and I begin blowing it into my waste jar, like that. I work the trigger back and forth, and then I just do this a few times to get it, and this, in the last few times, I'll put in a little more thinner than at the beginning of the cleaning process. And I just let it blow through like that. And you can hear when it's emptied. And then I just simply take a piece of paper towel or something that I can see what is happening, and I look for color to come out. Now I'm seeing just the tiniest hint of color coming out there, so I know I need to do that a couple of more times. But I would repeat that process until I didn't see any color coming out. Then as a final step, I would just put in a few drops and blast them through. Ah, you see that? There was still some green in there. That shows how paint can hide on you. You keep this process going at the end of your session until you don't get any color out. Let's do it one more time and see how it looks. Paint can hide in the airbrush. You'd be surprised how much paint can stick behind in the airbrush. Let me reduce that down a bit. Yeah. See, there's still green in there. But this demonstrates you just continue the process until you get it cleaned. Okay, that green proved a little trickier to clean out than I thought, but I basically just did the same process that I showed before. Put in thinner, blew it through, and just kept working that. Once you get it to the point that no paint is coming through, it's clear, then you've cleaned it enough to set it aside for storage until your next airbrush session. Now, one final thing I like to do is after I've got it running completely clear, is I just blow air through it for a minute and work the trigger. Make sure that everything inside is moving and there's nothing left to come out. And then all I'll do is I'll put on my protective cap and I'll set it aside for the evening so it's ready to go for the next session. Okay, a final note on cleaning. Every few weeks I like to break my airbrush down, take it apart, and clean it out thoroughly. You'll obviously want to follow your manufacturer's recommendations for this. There should be diagrams available to show you how to break it down. But the basic process is I like to start by first taking my needle out. That's generally the most fragile part of your airbrush. You don't want to bend the tip of that needle. And I set it aside. And then I take off the end cap. And I take it off as one piece. And then the nozzle, it may fall off, it may not. You may have to take it off, pull it off. I take off the end of the airbrush. I unscrew the doodad on the inside, and doodad is a technical term. And I pull it apart as one unit. It actually breaks down into different components. Then I pull out the trigger, and the trigger, I guess that's the trigger stop. And that's basically the point that I clean it at. It's not a bad idea to invest in some little brushes. This is one set that I have. I've got another set that they're not on this ring like that. But this allows you to get some thinner on the end of the brush, or to put some into the airbrush with another paintbrush, and just get in there and clean around inside. You want to be gentle, you want to be careful. If it's like this where it has the metal end, you don't want to be scratching around in there. But I generally clean all the way through from the front to the back, or actually back to the front. I try to push it out that way. Because there can be paint that will get back here in the body, and you can get that broken out of there using the appropriate thinner for the type of paint that you use. You'll want to clean out your air nozzle really well. If you have problems with paint flow as you're working, there may be paint stuck in here, and quite often I'll pop this off, leave pretty much everything else in place, pop this off, clean this out real good, and reassemble the end of the airbrush, and that can resolve a lot of problems. You'll want to clean this section out, run the brush through it, the cleaning brush through it. You want to give your needle a really good wipe down, because paint can build up along there, so you'll want to check that out. And then once you've got everything clean, I like to, as a final step, get some, because I use acrylics mostly, I like to get some hot water, not boiling hot, but I guess you'd say coffee hot. And I just drop these parts into it and let it sit in that warm water for a while. And that can help break up anything additional. And I go through with the brushes again and clean it up. And that tends to be everything that I need. But anyway, once you get it clean, you put it back together. As a last step after putting it back together, I like to run some water or some alcohol through it, just to make sure everything operates good, and then it's ready for your next session or for long-term storage. Okay, I've reassembled the airbrush and it's working just fine. I ran a little bit of thinner through it to make sure that everything was spraying well. A few other notes that came to mind as I was filming this that I thought I needed to mention. Earlier you had seen me mix the paint in my color cup. Because I tend to only use small quantities of paint at a time, just out of personal preference, that works really well. If you prefer to mix it outside of the color cup, that's fine. I like to get little mixing cups, the little medical plastic cups that are about this big, hold just a little bit of paint. You can put your thinner and put your paint in there, stir it up very thoroughly and just pour paint into your color cup, that works fine. If you're going to be using a large quantity of a mix of paint, you may want to invest in some empty jars and mix the paint in there. The one thing I don't recommend doing is pouring the paint directly from the bottle into the color cup, because when you pour it in, it's not only going to, even if you have thinner in there, that very thick paint is going to settle to the bottom and go right to the front of the nozzle. And it's not going to, even if you stir it up later, that portion of the paint is not going to get stirred up. And it's going to take you quite a while to blow through enough paint to where you're not fighting that thick paint. If you're using dropper bottle type paints, such as Vallejo Model Color, I definitely recommend mixing these up outside of the color cup. The Model Color paint is especially thick. It's great for brush painting, but if I'm using this through my airbrush or similar paints, I thin it before I put it in the color cup. Now, they have the Model Air line and other air lines that from other makers that I am confident of putting right in the color cup. In fact, Vallejo Model Air, I use it as is. I just drop it, put a few drops in from the bottle and spray it as it is. I rarely even thin that, but that's getting off on probably a topic for another day. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways of thinning your paints before you put it in the color cup or once you've got it in the color cup. You figure out what's best for you. The method that I demonstrated is what has worked for me for years. I like it. I've had people tell me it's the worst way to do it in the world, but I'm happy with my results. I've had others say, oh, that's a great way to do it. The same process applies, or the same thoughts kind of apply to cleaning your airbrush, both the way I demonstrated cleaning it between colors and after use, and talking about breaking it down and cleaning it. There's a lot of different methods, and if you see one in another video or somewhere online or a friend demonstrates that's different than what I've done and you like the way it works, go ahead and use it. I'm not by any stretch suggesting that mine is the perfect method. I've changed it a bit over the years. The backflow process that I showed you as part of the cleaning, I used to not do that because several people had told me, oh, that's horrible. It pushes paint back into the body of the airbrush and it does all sorts of nasty things to it. And then I started watching some people that I really respect them as airbrush artists, and I saw that they didn't even mention it. They just did it, and I saw them do it. I said, okay, I'll try it. Since then, I've done it. So the cleaning methods and the thinning methods and all of the ways that all of the little things that go into airbrushing, you may over time adjust. I have. The way I airbrush now is different than when I started back in 2006. So you'll find things that work for you. The best thing I can tell you is experiment with different techniques, with different styles, with different ways of doing it until you find one that works well for you. Okay, well that's going to wrap up this 3-part series on getting started in airbrushing. We've covered how to pick your airbrush, how to pick a compressor, and then how to make it all work, including thinning your paints, painting it onto the model, cleaning between colors, cleaning after your use, and then a big cleanup every couple of weeks. So there's still a lot that could be said about airbrushing. There's things about different paint types and techniques and methods and blending and all sorts of other things. But if you start off with the understanding of thinning and air pressure and a willingness to practice, and you get equipment that will support you to do it, all of those other things will come. First thing you want to do is just get a color on a model. But don't be afraid to tackle those more advanced techniques. Yeah, the first time you do it, it may not look great. First time I did things like pre-shading, it looked awful. I mean, I was embarrassed by it. I stripped it down and started over. I don't necessarily recommend stripping things down, but know that the first time you try it, it may not come out as good as you'd like. The other thing to keep in mind, the first time you try it, it may not look as good as you like. The second and third time, you may start thinking, hey, I'm really nailing this. Don't believe your own marketing too quickly, because initially when it starts looking good, and it's good, it's fine to feel good about that. When it starts looking good, you may want to step back and go, but you know what? After doing this 10 more times, it's going to look even better, because it will. So at any point in your airbrushing, in fact, in modeling in general, know that wherever you're at, if you keep working at it, if you keep practicing, 5 models on, 10 models on, it's going to look even better. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. I could keep rambling on, I suppose, but it's time to wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you've enjoyed the series. There's links in the description down below for my website, for my Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, all of those things. I do have a Patreon page. If you would like to support me in the work that I do, I would be most grateful for that. And to those who have stepped up to help support me on Patreon, thank you so much. It really has helped. So I appreciate it greatly. But keep in mind all of the things that I've talked about in these videos as you're getting started in your airbrush, and you'll do just fine. Just keep practicing, keep trying, keep learning, and you'll have a lot of fun with it, and you'll end up with some great looking models. So with that all being said, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye. Okay, wait a minute. You mean to tell me that this whole airbrushing thing is air pressure, thinning, and practice? That's it? Oh, I'm very disappointed. I was hoping there was going to be more talk of airbrush and airbrush accessories, such as valves and tubes and thinning things and all sorts of other things. Large devices that use up electricity, perhaps even propane. But you've boiled it down to some simple hippie stuff. Why, this is just an insult. I can't believe I even agreed to come to this place and do this silly video. You know what? Tear up my contract. I've had enough. This is more than I can take. I'm out of here. I'm done. I'm walking out. Goodbye. I've had it.